My husband announced at dinner he'd sold my cabin for $60,000 while I was overseas. His family cheered and called it financial genius. He didn't know what he'd actually sold. Owen said it the way he said everything he was proud of. Standing, glass raised, waiting for the room to arrange itself around him. You all know about Violet's little cabin? He paused. That pause. The one he used when he wanted you to feel the weight of what was coming. The specific theatrical beat of a man who has decided he is the most interesting person in the room and wants the room to confirm it. Her impractical purchase 3 years ago. Margaret laughed softly. His mother, seated at the head of her own table in the good pearls she reserved for occasions she considered significant. Richard, Owen's father, nodded with the slow gravity of a man endorsing a verdict. Mason, Owen's brother, leaned back in his chair with the anticipatory grin of someone who already knew the punchline. I had been home for 4 hours, Singapore for 4 months, 14-hour flight, 2 connection delays. I had come directly from the airport to this dinner because Owen had texted me 3 times saying it was important, that the family was together, that I should come straight there. I should have known that important and good were not the same word. I sold it, Owen said. While she was overseas, $60,000. The room erupted. Margaret clapped. The specific, contained clap of a woman who considers enthusiasm a performance and performs it accordingly. Richard said, "That's my boy," with the satisfaction of a man whose son has finally done something he can brag about. Mason whistled. Owen gestured at the table. The roast in the center, the wine, the tiramisu on the sideboard that Margaret had clearly spent the afternoon preparing. The money for this dinner? It's from the cabin sale. He looked at me then, directly, with the smile he used when he wanted me to see that he had solved something I hadn't known needed solving. At least one meal is covered. They laughed. At the joke, at the sale, at me. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I kept my face still. This is something I have become very good at, keeping my face still while something large arrives. I have had 6 years of practice. I picked up my wine glass. That's something, I said. Owen sat down, pleased with himself, and began explaining to Richard his investment plans for the remaining $59,000. Under the table, I looked at my phone. Harrison Blackwell, attorney at law, a number I didn't recognize, and a text arrived 2 hours earlier while my plane was still descending over the Pacific from a number I recognized immediately. Special Agent Catherine Reeves, aware of situation regarding your Pine Grove property. Maintain normal behavior. Attend family dinner as planned. Keep subjects unaware. Team mobilizing. I set my phone face down on my thigh. Across the table, Owen was describing a real estate investment strategy to his father, with the confidence of a man who has just proven something and is now extrapolating from the proof. Through the curtains behind him, I could see the driveway, still empty, not for long. Let me tell you about the cabin, because the cabin is the beginning of everything, and because what Owen called impractical was the most careful thing I have ever done. My name is Violet Whitmore. I am 38 years old. For the last 11 years, I have worked as a compliance analyst, and more recently, a senior field consultant for a government-adjacent private contractor, whose specific work I am not going to describe in detail, because the NDA I signed is very good, and I respect good NDAs. What I can tell you is that the work involves international regulatory compliance, that it has taken me to 14 countries in 6 years, and that 3 years ago, when my security clearance was renewed and my assignment profile was upgraded, the nature of what that clearance covered changed in ways that had material consequences for my personal assets. The cabin was in Pine Grove, Washington, 2 acres of Douglas fir and a creek that ran cold and clear from March through October, a structure I had bought for $38,000 from an estate sale because it was remote and honest, and mine in the specific way that things are yours when you choose them without anyone else's input or approval. Owen had called it impractical from the moment I bought it. He meant, I don't see the value. He meant, this is not something that reflects well on us. He meant, underneath all of that, the thing he always meant. This is yours and not mine, and that makes me uncomfortable. I had bought it anyway, with money from a consulting bonus that preceded our marriage and that I had kept in a separate account because I am, by training and by temperament, a person who maintains clear documentation of what belongs to whom. The security clearance upgrade happened in January of the year I went to Singapore. My compliance officer, a man named Gerald Huang, 24 years in federal contractor security, the most methodical person I have ever sat across from in a conference room, had explained the asset registration requirement to me in the specific language of someone who needs you to understand something precisely. Any real property owned by personnel at your clearance level needs to be registered in the federal asset database, he said. This is not discretionary. It flags the property as a secured asset. Any attempt to transfer it triggers automatic notification through multiple channels. What kind of transfer? I said. Sale, deed change, title modification, any of it. He looked at me steadily. The database is watched. Any irregularity is flagged immediately. I had registered the cabin in February. The utilities were automated. A property management company was hired. Security cameras were installed. Standard protocol, Gerald had said, for registered assets of any kind. I told Owen the cabin was handled while I was away. I did not tell him the specifics, because the specifics were subject to the NDA, and because Owen's relationship with information I shared with him had, over 6 years, demonstrated that he used it primarily in ways that served him. In March, I left for Singapore. In April, Owen found the deed. I need to tell you about Owen the way you tell someone about weather. Not because you're warning them, exactly, but because understanding understanding the climate explains every decision made in it. Owen Whitmore is 41 years old. He is handsome in the easy, maintained way of men who have always been told they are the smartest person in the room and have taken that assessment as a permanent license rather than a provisional verdict. He works in commercial real estate development, not as the developer, but in the adjacency role of someone who facilitates and advises and takes fees, which is a legitimate profession and one at which Owen is genuinely skilled when the skill is being deployed for other people. For himself, the skill had a tendency to misfire. He had made 3 significant financial decisions in our marriage. 1 had been correct, 2 had not. The incorrect ones had cost us a combined $140,000 in the way that bad real estate decisions cost money, slowly, then suddenly, with a period in between where you almost believe it's going to work out. After the second one, I had quietly separated my finances into a structure that Owen knew existed, but whose details he did not have. This is a thing that some people will call controlling and that I call prudent. And the difference between those two assessments depends on whether you have spent 6 years watching someone make decisions with your money. I am not going to pretend I didn't know who Owen was when I married him. I knew who he was. I had believed, with the specific optimism of someone who wants to be wrong about their own assessment, that the version of him I saw in the early years was the primary version, and that the other version was a function of circumstances that would change. The circumstances did not change. The other version became the primary one. By the time I left for Singapore, I had consulted a divorce attorney named Patricia Chen, 17 years in family law, the kind of attorney who asks 3 questions before any others and listens very carefully to the answers. Our consultations were preliminary. I was documenting. I was building a picture of the full financial landscape before any decisions were made. I was doing what I do professionally. I was doing compliance. I had not expected Owen to accelerate the timeline quite so dramatically. The safe was in my home office. A combination safe, fireproof, the kind that holds documents rather than valuables. I do not keep valuables in the house, because Gerald Huang had told me that the security profile for personnel at my clearance level made concentrated valuables a liability. The combination was the date Owen and I had met, which I had set 3 years ago because I was still in the phase of believing that shared dates meant something. He had told Mason at the dinner table that the combination was our anniversary. Close enough, same month, different year. He had been practicing on a date that was slightly wrong and had stumbled onto the right one, which is the kind of luck that people who don't deserve it sometimes have. He had found the deed. He had spent 3 days practicing my signature from my old journals, and I want to stay with that detail for a moment because it is the detail that tells you everything. He didn't do this spontaneously. He had my journals. He had identified the correct documents. He had practiced repeatedly until he felt confident. This was not an impulsive act. This was a plan. The V in Violet tilted wrong, he'd told Mason proudly, but I got the pressure right. He had forged my signature on the transfer documents, found a buyer through a contact in his real estate network, and sold a federally registered secured asset for $60,000, approximately $22,000 below its assessed value, which tells you something about how carefully he'd researched the transaction. The federal database had flagged the transfer the moment it processed. I did not know about the flag when it happened. I was in Singapore documenting regulatory non-compliance in a facility that would have given Gerald Huang a professional crisis, doing the work I was there to do. I found out about the flag through Catherine Reeves, who had been my contact during my clearance renewal and who had texted me 2 hours before I landed, with instructions that I followed because I trust Catherine Reeves the way you trust someone who has demonstrated repeatedly that their judgment is sound. Maintain normal behavior. Attend family dinner as planned. Keep subjects unaware. Team mobilizing. I had read that text at 34,000 feet over the Pacific, and I had thought, of course he did. Not surprise. Just the arrival of confirmation for something I had been partially expecting in various forms. I had taken a breath. I had thought about what the next 4 hours required of me. Then I had closed my eyes and slept for 2 hours, because I had learned a long time ago that you cannot perform correctly when you are exhausted, and what was coming required a correct performance. The call from Harrison Blackwell came at 7:42 p.m., while Owen was explaining to Richard the difference between short-term and long-term real estate investment strategies. I excused myself to the porch. The night was cold. Late October in Washington means the kind of cold that has edges, not brutal, but present, the kind that clarifies. Mrs. Whitmore. Blackwell's voice had the quality of a man who has spent 30 years practicing composure and is currently failing. I represent the buyers for the Pine Grove property transaction. Yes, I said. There are federal financial investigators at our office. A pause. The kind of pause that contains several things at once. They've seized files. They're describing it as flagged property, restricted asset status, forged transfer documents. They're using words I don't. This is not a situation I have encountered before, and I need to understand. Mr. Blackwell, I said. I didn't authorize the sale. Silence. I was in Singapore, I said. The cabin is a registered federal asset. The signature on the transfer documents is not mine. I assume you're going to want to cooperate with the investigation. More silence. We had no knowledge, he started. I know you didn't, I said. That's going to matter. I went back inside. Owen was now describing to Mason a property he'd seen in Scottsdale that he thought had potential. The tiramisu had been served. Margaret was refilling wine. I sat at my place at the far end of the table, the place they always put me, at the end furthest from the conversation's center, like an addendum, and I picked up my dessert fork. The tiramisu was very good. Margaret makes excellent tiramisu. I was on my second bite when the first black vehicle turned into the driveway. Here is the thing about watching people who have underestimated you encounter the consequences of that underestimation. It is not the satisfaction you might expect. It is something quieter and more complicated. The specific feeling of a thing arriving that has been on its way for a long time, that you have been tracking from a distance with the same professional attention you give to any complex system approaching a point of failure. I watched through the curtains. First vehicle, government plates, as Reeves had described in our previous call. A black SUV, the kind that is not trying to look inconspicuous. Second vehicle. Third, six figures emerging with the coordinated calm of people who have done this before and find the choreography unremarkable. Reeves in front, I recognized her posture before I could see her face, the specific uprightness of someone who considers their bearing part of their professional instrument. Quick pause. If you want more stories like this in better quality, my Spotify's linked in the description. Owen was explaining the Scottsdale property's cap rate to Mason. I'll get the door, I said. He barely looked up. I crossed Margaret's polished hardwood floors, bought during a renovation 2 years ago that Owen had loudly taken credit for suggesting and had contributed exactly nothing financially toward, and I opened the front door before Reeves could knock. She looked at me. I looked at her. Are all subjects present? She asked. Quiet, professional. The voice of someone reading from a checklist that has been carefully prepared. Dining room, I said. Having dessert? She nodded once. They came in. 6 pairs of federal footsteps on Margaret's hardwood, moving from the entry toward the dining room with the specific pace of people who are not hurrying because they don't need to, because every exit has been accounted for. Every variable has been assessed, and the only thing remaining is the delivery. Owen's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. The tiramisu on his fork held its position for a moment, perfectly still, suspended, and then slid off in slow motion and landed on the tablecloth. Margaret's hand flew to her pearls. Richard's face did the thing faces do when they encounter something they have no category for, a blankness, a rapid recalculation, a reaching for dignity in a moment that has removed the scaffolding dignity requires. Mason just stared. Catherine Reeves, Special Agent Catherine Reeves, 12 years with the Federal Financial Crimes Task Force, a woman whose professional calm I had witnessed during 2 clearance renewals and 1 extremely tense deposition, raised her badge under Margaret's chandelier. Owen Whitmore, she said, you are being taken into custody in connection with wire fraud, forgery, and conspiracy related to the unauthorized transfer of a federally registered secured asset. Owen stood. The chair scraped the hardwood with a sound that Margaret would probably think about for years. It was a property deal, he said. A simple real estate transaction. His voice had the quality of a man who is deploying the explanation he prepared and is discovering that the explanation does not fit the room. Selling federally registered property using forged documents, Reeves said, in the even tone of someone reading a definition, is not a simple transaction. Margaret said, he was being resourceful. I want to stay with that for a moment. He was being resourceful, as though resourcefulness is a defense, as though the resourcefulness of the act, the safe combination, the practiced signature, the found deed, the buyer located through a real estate contact, offset its nature. This is the specific logic of a family that has spent 40 years reframing Owen's choices as virtues and has not yet understood that the reframing only works inside the room where everyone already agrees. This room had new occupants now. Richard tried to stand. One of the agents, a younger man, calm, positioned precisely for this contingency, said quietly, please remain seated. Richard sat. The forged documents were on the table. Owen had brought them to dinner. I don't know why. To show the family, perhaps, to provide evidence of the transaction for the toast. To have the physical artifact of his accomplishment present in the room where he intended to be celebrated. He had spread them on the sideboard before dinner, shown them to Mason, let Margaret hold the transfer paperwork. An agent photographed them in situ. The forged documents, the dinner spread, the half-consumed tiramisu, the wine glasses still raised from the most recent toast. A complete document of a celebration. Evidence and celebration in the same frame. Owen turned to me. He had been moving through stages. I watched it happen with the detached observation of someone who has been watching Owen move through stages for 6 years and has learned to read the sequence. Confusion first, then the recalculation, the reaching for an explanation that would reframe what was happening, then the anger. Brief, hot, the anger of a man whose plan has encountered reality and who needs someone to blame for the collision. Then finally, desperation. Violet. His voice had dropped. Not quiet from composure. Quiet from the specific deflation of a man whose performance has encountered an audience it cannot reach. Tell them this is a misunderstanding. You're my wife. I looked at him. 6 years of silence. Not the silence of someone who has nothing to say. The silence of someone who has learned that saying things into that particular room produces no result, and who has therefore stopped saying them, and who has been mistaken for absent when she was simply waiting. He had always mistaken my silence for surrender. For the first time, it wasn't. I didn't say anything. I want to tell you what came after because after is where the actual story lives, and because I have consumed enough of these stories to know that they often end at the dramatic moment and leave out the part where you have to inhabit the aftermath. Owen was taken in that night. Reeves's team moved efficiently and without drama. He was processed, booked, and released on a bond that his parents spent most of the following day arranging. Harrison Blackwell's firm cooperated fully with investigators, which was the correct decision, and which Blackwell had clearly made before he hung up with me on the porch. The buyers, a retired couple from Tacoma who had been genuinely excited about a property with a creek, were extricated from the transaction with the assistance of their own attorney and the cooperation of the federal investigation. They lost the closing costs. They were compensated through a process I won't detail here except to say that Gerald Huang's office had anticipated the possibility and had structured the asset registration accordingly. The property was returned to my name, or rather, it had never left my name. The transfer had been flagged and frozen before it was finalized, which is what happens when you try to sell a federal asset with a forged signature in an era of automated database monitoring. Owen had been very precise about the signature pressure. He had not been precise about what he was signing. Patricia Chen, my family law attorney, 17 years in practice, the woman who had been building a picture with me for months, filed the divorce petition the following week. The wire fraud charge, the forgery charge, and the conspiracy charge that was added when the investigation expanded to include Mason's foreknowledge, he had known about the sale in advance and had said nothing, created a legal landscape that Patricia described to me as clarifying. Clarifying, I said. For asset division purposes, she said. Among other things. I appreciated the precision. Gerald Huang called me 2 days after the dinner. He has the specific quality of a man who never says I told you so because he considers the facts sufficient on their own. The system worked, he said. The system worked, I said. I'm glad you completed the registration before you left. So am I said. I had not, in the 4 months I was in Singapore, fully understood how glad I would be. I moved back into my own apartment, the one I had kept quietly on a lease in my name only, the one that Owen didn't know about because there are some things that the compliance training teaches you that are more personally useful than professionally useful, and one of them is, always maintain a secured exit. The cabin is still mine. I went there in November, 2 weeks after everything, and I drove the 4 hours in my Subaru with coffee in the cup holder and the radio on, and when I turned onto the property road and saw the creek through the trees, I felt something I don't have the right word for. Not triumph, not relief, exactly. Something more like return, like arriving at something that had been waiting. I sat on the porch for a long time. The creek ran cold and clear. The Douglas firs held their ground the way Douglas firs do, without drama, without reference to what had happened below them, indifferent and permanent. I had bought this property with money that predated the marriage, for a reason I could not have fully articulated at the time, and it had turned out to be the most important thing I owned. Not because of its value, which had appreciated to approximately $82,000 since the purchase, because it was mine, specifically and documentably mine, in a way that had ultimately been enforced by systems so much larger than anything Owen had thought to account for. He had found the deed in my safe. He had practiced my signature for 3 days. He had sold a federally registered secured asset and announced the proceeds at a family dinner before the transaction had cleared federal monitoring. And then he had looked at me across a dining room table and said, "You're my wife," as though that were the relevant variable. As though the relevant variable were anything other than the fact that what he had sold was not his to sell, had never been his to sell, and had been registered in systems whose existence he had not thought to ask about because he had spent 6 years not asking me things. He had looked at my silence and seen surrender. He had been wrong about that for 6 years. He found out on a Thursday night, over tiramisu, with 3 federal vehicles in the driveway, and Catherine Reeves under the chandelier. Some corrections are proportional to the error. This one was. Reeves called me in December with a case update. The charges had proceeded to indictment. Owen's attorney, a man named Douglas Farr, 20 years in white-collar criminal defense, someone Patricia Chen described to me as good, but working with a difficult client, had entered preliminary negotiations. Mason's charge had been reduced in exchange for cooperation. Richard and Margaret were not charged, but had provided depositions that I understood, from Reeves's tone when she mentioned them, had not been comfortable experiences. "How are you?" Reeves asked, before she hung up. It was the kind of question that people ask when they want to give you the opportunity to say something other than fine, when they have been present for something and have a sense of what the aftermath of it might look like. "Clear," I said. "I feel clear." She was quiet for a moment. "The registration saved you," she said. "If the transfer had gone through before we flagged it, the recovery would have been significantly more complicated." "I know," I said. "Gerald is very thorough." "He is," I said. "That's why I listened to him." She laughed, a brief, genuine sound, the laugh of someone who has been professional for so long that genuine laughter has become slightly surprising to them when it arrives. "Take care of yourself," she said. "I will," I said, and meant it in the specific way of someone who has been taking care of herself for a long time without fully acknowledging it, who has just watched the system she built hold up under pressure, and who has arrived at the other side of the experience, understanding something she probably knew before but can now say plainly. The silence was never surrender. It was patience. It was documentation. It was a federal asset registration and a divorce attorney and a separate apartment on a lease in my name and a cabin in the Douglas firs with a creek that runs cold and clear from March through October. It was everything I had built while he was busy deciding that what was mine was available to be taken. He was wrong about that. He found out in the dining room that.